Somewhere in a research lab right now, a machine is listening to something that should not exist. Not a new species, not a newly discovered language buried in some remote jungle. Something far stranger. A machine is listening to the sounds a crow makes, and it is finding, buried inside those sounds, the same underlying mathematics that built every sentence you have ever spoken. Every word you're reading right now. Every thought you have ever translated into language was built on a structure that scientists believed was exclusively, uniquely, unshakably human. That belief did not survive the year 2024. For over 60 years, one idea sat at the foundation of an entire branch of science. Human language is different. Not different in degree, different in kind. Other animals could bark, chirp, howl, and screech, but only humans could take a finite set of sounds and arrange them into an infinite number of meanings. This idea had a name. Linguists called it the language faculty, and they believed it was hardwired into the human brain and nowhere else. It was the line that separated us from every other creature on the planet. It was the reason we built cities and they built nests. And in the last 2 years, a piece of software has walked directly through that line, and nobody in the field has fully recovered from what it found on the other side. Here is where this gets uncomfortable. The researchers did not set out to challenge the foundations of linguistics. They set out to do something much smaller. They wanted to know what crows were saying to each other. That is where it started. That is not where it ended. The project began with a simple, almost mundane problem. Crows make an enormous number of sounds, and the overwhelming majority of them are quiet, not the loud, aggressive caw that people associate with the birds. Most crow vocalization is soft, layered, low in volume, and easy for the human ear to dismiss as background noise. For decades, this meant that entire libraries of crow communication went unstudied, not because scientists were uninterested, but because no human research team could realistically process the sheer volume of sound involved. You cannot sit a graduate student down with headphones for 10,000 hours and expect reliable results. The data was too large for a human mind to hold. So the researchers did what an increasing number of fields are doing when the data outgrows the human capacity to analyze it. They handed it to a machine. Specifically, they handed it to a large-scale AI system trained not to write essays or generate images, but to find statistical structure inside raw sound. The kind of structure a human ear cannot detect, but a sufficiently powerful pattern recognition system can. The model had one job in its first pass: sort the sounds into categories, separate call types, cluster similar acoustic signatures together, and look for anything that repeated in a way that suggested it was meaningful rather than random. This is a standard first step in animal communication research, and nobody expected it to produce anything more than a slightly more organized catalog of grunts and warnings. Instead, the machine returned something that made several members of the research team go back and rerun the analysis, certain they had made an error. They had not made an error. What the AI detected was not a simple signal system. A simple signal system is a fixed vocabulary. A specific sound always means the same specific thing, in the same order. Every time, the way a fire alarm always means the same thing, regardless of context. That is not structure. That is a switch. What the machine found in the crow recordings was something categorically different. It found combinatorial patterns. Smaller sound units being rearranged, recombined, and reordered to produce what appeared to be different shades of meaning depending on the sequence, not just the presence of specific units. In human linguistics, there is a name for this property, and it is considered one of the non-negotiable hallmarks of true language. It is called generativity, the capacity to take a limited set of building blocks and generate a functionally unlimited number of distinct messages by changing how those blocks are ordered. It is the reason you can produce a sentence that has never been spoken before in the history of the species and be perfectly understood. It is the property that separates a language from a signal light. The AI was detecting the statistical fingerprint of generativity in the vocal output of a bird with a brain the size of a walnut. To understand why this detonated so much settled science, you have to understand what generations of researchers assumed about the boundary between animal communication and human language. The classic framework, built largely on the work of linguists in the mid-20th century, drew a hard line. On one side, animal signals, fixed, finite, context-bound. A vervet monkey has a specific alarm call for a leopard and a different specific alarm call for an eagle. And that is remarkable, but it is still a closed system. The monkey cannot rearrange those two calls to communicate a new idea about a leopard that is also somehow airborne. On the other side of the line sat human language, open, recursive, capable of infinite recombination. The AI analysis of crow vocalizations does not just blur that line. It suggests the line may never have been where scientists thought it was. The researchers began looking more closely at what these recombined sound sequences were actually doing, and the results moved from academically interesting to genuinely strange. The AI identified specific sound units that functioned differently depending on what they were paired with, the acoustic equivalent of a word changing meaning based on the words around it. This is called compositionality, another property long assumed to be a uniquely human linguistic tool. A crow call that, on its own, seemed to indicate general alertness would combine with a second unit to indicate something far more specific, a particular type of threat at a particular distance, requiring a particular type of group response. Neither unit alone carried that specific meaning. Only the combination did. Compositionality is not a minor technical detail buried in an academic paper. It is close to the central engine of everything human language can do. It is why the sentence "the crow attacked the hawk" means something completely different from "the hawk attacked the crow," using the exact same three words, meaning built from arrangement, not just from vocabulary. For most of the history of linguistics, this was presented in textbooks as evidence of a cognitive leap that only one species on Earth had ever made. The machine kept finding it in a species that split from the human evolutionary line roughly 300 million years ago, a species whose most recent common ancestor with humans was not a primate, was not even a mammal, was a creature so distant from us on the tree of life that shared brain architecture should have been essentially impossible. And that is where the second collision with settled science happened. Because for the crow findings to matter this much, researchers first had to explain how a bird brain could support anything resembling this kind of processing at all. For most of the 20th century, neuroscience operated on an assumption that seemed self-evidently reasonable. Complex cognition requires a cerebral cortex, the layered, folded structure that makes up the outer surface of the mammalian brain, or the part of the human brain most associated with reasoning, planning, and language processing. Birds do not have a cortex. Their brains are smooth, small, and structured completely differently. For decades, this was treated as case closed. No cortex, no complex cognition, no possibility of anything approaching language. What researchers eventually discovered is that evolution does not require a single blueprint to arrive at a similar outcome. Birds evolved an entirely separate brain structure called the pallium that bears no physical resemblance to the mammalian cortex, but performs strikingly similar computational work, built from densely packed neurons organized in a completely different architecture. Pound for pound, the neuron density in a crow's brain rivals that of primates. Researchers studying corvid cognition, the family that includes crows, ravens, and jays, have taken to calling these birds feathered apes, a phrase that used to sound like a cute headline and now reads like a literal description of processing capacity. This is the piece that makes the language finding land differently than it would if it had come from, say, a dolphin or a chimpanzee. Animals already assumed to be cognitively sophisticated. Crows arrived at something resembling generative, compositional communication, using a brain built on an entirely different architecture than the one linguists assumed was required to produce it. That is not evidence of a shared linguistic ancestor. It is evidence of something far more unsettling for the field. It is evidence of convergent evolution toward language itself, evidence that the underlying mathematics of structured communication may not require a specific brain plan at all. It may simply be what happens when a sufficiently social, sufficiently intelligent species needs to coordinate complex information across a group. If that is true, the old question, why do only humans have language, may have been the wrong question all along. The right question may be closer to, what conditions produce language, regardless of the hardware running it? And once you ask the question that way, the entire architecture of comparative linguistics starts to look different. The researchers pushed further, and the next finding is the one that made its way out of academic circles and into public conversation because it touches something linguists have treated as almost sacred: recursion. Recursion is the ability to embed one structure inside another of the same type, the linguistic equivalent of a sentence inside a sentence inside a sentence, without theoretical limit. It is why you can say, the scientist who studied the bird that learned the call believes the pattern will spread, a sentence containing multiple nested clauses that a listener can still parse without confusion. For a long stretch of modern linguistics, recursion was treated as the single defining feature of human language, the one property no animal communication system had ever been shown to possess, the final, unbreachable wall. The AI analysis of the crow data did not conclusively prove full recursive structure. The researchers are careful about that distinction, and this is a place where the science remains genuinely unsettled rather than settled in the bird's favor. But what the machine did detect were hierarchical dependencies, sound units whose relationship to each other spanned across intervening units in a way that a simple, linear, one after another signal chain cannot explain. In plain terms, some elements of a call sequence appeared to depend on other elements that were not adjacent to them, the acoustic equivalent of a sentence where the subject and the verb agree with each other across several intervening words. That is a hallmark of the kind of layered structure recursion requires, even if it does not yet prove the deepest form of it. Several of the researchers involved describe this finding as the one that kept them up at night. not because it is definitive, but because it is exactly the kind of evidence that, if replicated and extended, would remove the last major theoretical firewall between animal signaling and human grammar. To be clear about what kind of study this actually was, because the scale of it matters. The AI system involved was not trained on crow sounds alone and left to guess. It was built on the same class of self-supervised architecture used to find structure in human speech and text, models capable of learning statistical regularities without being told in advance what those regularities should look like. The researchers fed the system hundreds of thousands of individual vocalizations, collected over multiple years from wild crow populations using small, unobtrusive microphones placed near nests and roosting sites, paired with continuous behavioral tracking, so the team could later cross-reference what the birds were doing with what the birds were producing acoustically at that exact moment. This is a critical detail. The AI was not simply told to find pretty patterns in noise. Every structural claim it produced was checked against real, observed physical behavior. When the model flagged a sequence as functioning like a warning, researchers went back to the footage and confirmed that a warning, appropriate behavior, scattering, mobbing, silence, followed. When it flagged a sequence as an individual identifier, they confirmed that the sequence appeared specifically and repeatedly around one particular human and not others. The structure was not imagined. It was cross-validated against reality, which is precisely why a finding this large has survived peer review instead of being dismissed as an artifact of an overzealous algorithm. It is also worth understanding why no human research team had done this work already, because the answer says something about the limits of human perception itself. A trained ornithologist, listening in real time, can reliably distinguish perhaps a handful of broad call categories: alarm, contact, begging, aggression. That has been the working vocabulary of crow bioacoustics for the better part of a century. The AI was not limited by a human ear's frequency resolution or a human brain's attention span. It processed the full acoustic detail of every vocalization, including frequency modulations lasting a few thousandths of a second, amplitude, shifts too small for a human listener to consciously register, and timing relationships between sound units spread out over several seconds, well beyond what human short-term auditory memory can reliably track and compare. In other words, the structure researchers are now describing was never actually hidden from the crows. It was hidden from us. The birds have, in some sense, been having this conversation in plain sight the entire time. We simply did not have the equipment to hear it. While the linguistic side of the story was unfolding, a separate and equally strange thread emerged from the same dataset. And this is the part of the research that turned an academic paper into something closer to a horror story about being watched. The AI identified specific, consistent sound sequences that appeared to function as unique identifiers, not for categories of things, but for individual humans. Not a general call meaning dangerous person is near, a specific, repeatable sequence tied to one specific human, produced by multiple different crows, including crows, that had never personally interacted with that human at all. The researchers described these sequences as functioning like proper nouns. In the most direct sense available to the data, the crows had assigned names, encoding not just identity, but an emotional charge, a threat or reward classification attached to the individual being referenced. This is where the story stops being a curiosity about animal cognition and becomes something closer to a mirror. If a species with a walnut-sized brain and an evolutionary path 300 million years removed from our own can independently develop combinatorial sound sequences, context-dependent meaning shifts, individualized referential naming, and structural dependencies that echo the deep architecture of human grammar, then the thing that made human language special was never a magic ingredient locked inside our own species. It may simply be a threshold, a level of social complexity and cognitive demand that, once crossed, produces something recognizable as language, almost regardless of what kind of brain is doing the crossing. The researchers are careful, in every published statement, to avoid saying that crows have language in the full human sense. That claim would outrun the data, and serious scientists working on this project have said so explicitly and repeatedly. What they are willing to say, and what has rattled the field far more than a simple overreach ever could, is that the tools built to analyze crow sound are now good enough to detect statistical signatures that used to be considered exclusively human markers. And those signatures are showing up in a species nobody expected to have them. That single sentence is quietly rewriting an entire academic discipline in real time. There is a further layer to this that the researchers have only recently begun to discuss publicly, and it concerns what happened as the AI models improved. As the classification systems became more sensitive, more capable of detecting subtle structural patterns, the crow populations under observation began producing new vocal patterns that the earlier models could not classify at all. New structural elements appeared, spread through local flocks with the same speed as any other piece of crow-to-crow information, and then moved outward into neighboring territories. Confidence metrics that had been stable throughout the study dropped sharply. The machine, for a period, stopped translating and started simply recording something it could not parse. Researchers have proposed, cautiously, that the birds may have been responding to the presence of the recording equipment and the altered behavior of the human observers around them, adjusting their communication in ways that made it harder for an outside system to model. Whether that adjustment was a deliberate response to being studied or an incidental drift in vocal culture that happened to coincide with the observation period is a question the field cannot yet answer with confidence. What is not in dispute is the timeline. The pattern shift appeared after the AI became good enough to start reliably decoding what came before it. Step back from the crows for a moment because the implications of this research reach directly back to human language, which is where the title of this story and the discomfort underneath it actually lives. If generativity, compositionality, and structural dependency can emerge independently in a bird brain built on a completely different architecture than our own, then human language may not be the product of one specific evolutionary miracle. It may be the product of a much more general principle, one that applies any time a sufficiently social species needs to transmit detailed, individualized, forward-looking information across a group faster than direct experience allows. Under that framework, human language is not a lightning strike. It is a convergent solution, one of potentially many, to a problem that intelligent social creatures face regardless of what kind of brain they are running. That reframing matters far beyond a linguistics journal. It touches the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, where scientists have long debated whether communication systems elsewhere in the universe would even be recognizable to us, or whether they would be built on principles so different from human grammar that we would fail to identify them as language at all. If structured, generative, compositional communication can independently emerge on a single planet in at least two wildly different neural architectures, separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution, it suggests structured language may be a far more common outcome of complex cognition than researchers previously assumed on this planet and potentially beyond it. It touches artificial intelligence research directly because the same models being used to detect structure in crow vocalizations are close cousins of the models used to detect structure in human language itself. Researchers involved in this project have noted, somewhat uneasily, that the machine did not need to understand what a crow was, did not need any built-in assumption about bird cognition to find these patterns. It simply looked for the mathematics of structured communication and found it, which raises an uncomfortable question sitting quietly underneath the entire field right now. If the same mathematics shows up in a species we never suspected, what else might be running that same mathematics that we have simply never bothered to point the machine at? And it touches something more immediate and more personal than any of that. It touches the story you started this video wondering about, the one about a machine finding structure in the sounds of an animal outside your own window. Because the honest answer to what these scientists discovered is not that crows are secretly human-level intelligent. It is something stranger and, in its own way, more humbling. It is that the wall separating human language from everything else in nature may never have been as solid as we assumed. It may have simply been the limit of our ability to listen closely enough to notice what was happening on the other side of it. There is one more piece of this that the researchers return to whenever they are asked to summarize what the finding actually means, and it is worth sitting with, because it is not really a claim about crows at all. It is a claim about method. For the entire history of the search for language beyond our own species, the test has been anthropocentric, almost by necessity. Scientists looked for animal behavior that resembled human language closely enough for a human to recognize it as language, which means the search was always limited by human intuition about what language should sound like and look like. A system that only finds what it already expects to find is not really searching, it is confirming. The shift represented by this project is that, for the first time, the search tool itself has no human intuition to confirm. It does not know what a sentence is supposed to feel like. It does not carry any assumption that language requires a mouth shaped like ours, or a throat structured like ours. It only knows how to find statistical regularity, wherever that regularity happens to live. And when a tool with no preconceptions was finally pointed at a non-human species with enough patience and enough data, it did not come back empty. It came back with generativity, compositionality, and structural dependency, the exact fingerprints linguists had spent decades insisting only humans could produce. That is the part of this story that should unsettle you more than any individual finding. About crows recognizing your face or naming you in their calls. It is not really a story about how smart crows turned out to be. It is a story about how narrow our search for language has been for most of scientific history, and about what might be waiting to be found the moment someone points a sufficiently unbiased tool at the rest of the animal world. Whales sing in patterned sequences that have never been fully decoded. Elephants produce infrasound communication far below human hearing that researchers still cannot fully classify. Octopuses change color and texture in patterns nobody has systematically modeled at all, using a nervous system that evolved along a path so different from ours that direct comparison barely makes sense. Every one of those systems was, until recently, examined primarily through the same limited human ear and human intuition that spent a century insisting bird brains were too smooth to support anything resembling thought. If crows were hiding a structured communication system in plain acoustic sight for this long, the honest, uncomfortable question is not whether other species might be doing the same thing. It is how many of them already are, quietly right now, in frequencies and patterns nobody has yet built the right machine to hear. The machine is still running, the recordings are still coming in, and somewhere in that ongoing analysis, researchers are trying to answer a question that used to have an easy answer, and no longer does. What actually makes a language a language? Because right now, on a wire above a street somewhere, in a set of vocalizations too quiet for human ear to register as significant, something with a brain the size of a walnut may already be doing it. And the only reason we know that now, after ignoring it for the entire span of human civilization, is that we finally built a machine willing to listen without assuming in advance what it was allowed to hear.